Okay, here we go. 25 minutes of real estate contracts and contingency. Some of the stuff you guys use now, some of it you don't. I'm hoping to get a rise out of one or two of you about a few things that I consistently use in contracts and contingencies that you guys need to consider. So let's see. Let's move forward. Okay. I thought that was neat with the little alarm clock dinging like that. Isn't that fun? Yeah. Okay. I thought it was. Okay. So what's a contingency? A contingency, and this is what my AI told me: a future event or circumstance which is possible but cannot be predicted with certainty. Now, I understand that in life, but that it's not really the application for real estate. Here's a better definition in real estate. In a real estate contract, contingencies are items that need to be accomplished in order to move the agreement forward or further. So the contingency is placed there by the buyer or the seller, and they have to be addressed in order to move the contract forward. So, what are some standard contract contingencies? There's some popular real estate contract contingencies: property inspections, financing, and appraisal. They're all contingencies. And what I thought was just crazy was a year ago that buyers were buying houses without an appraisal contingency. Unless they're professional real estate agents or investors, how would they know what the house is worth? It sounds like you're counting on your neighbors to tell you what stuff is the truth and which is not. But that's a story for another day, and today's not that day. So let's go to the contingencies individually. Property inspections. Oh, I got two people. Hold on. Property inspection, seller limitation clause. So, as you know, in most contracts, when they first fire up, the seller is going to be responsible to make repairs up to a certain point. I'd say sometimes it's 3%, sometimes it's 2%, sometimes it's 4%. And that's pretty much up to the seller. Once he sees that contract, it's up to the seller to determine what he wants to accept on the contract. Because the contract's going to come in with a number, and the seller can either take it the way it is, or they can make a change to it. Now, you know, every change that you make, you risk the buyer walking away. But okay, so let's say the standard, I think it's 3%, which is reasonable, 3% limitation clause. Now, when I was at Synergy, we had an addendum, and we'll get into addendums another day, but we had an addendum that we used on every single contract because our addendum, we understood and we knew where everything was on the addendum. Unlike a contract, if you're looking for where the seller limitation clause is on repairs, you may have to do some searching. It might be paragraph 5, might be 9, who knows? There might not be any room to write on it, but we use an addendum. And one of the items in our addendum is that we, as the seller, if the inspections came out and it was over the limitation clause of normally 3%, we, as the seller, had the option to make the repairs above and over 3%. Now, it's always good to have the option to do something, but as sellers of foreclosed properties we bought at the sale, there was a lot of properties that just didn't meet snuff. In other words, they needed some repairs, and we knew it. And we wanted to get rid of that property in such a fashion and so quickly that we wanted to have the option to make the repairs that ended up over the limitations. Because if you don't have something in writing in your addendum or in the contract that says the seller has the option to make the repairs over the limitation, then once it gets to 3%, there's nothing you can do. You can't renegotiate the contract now. Number one. Number two, the buyer is going to go, well, okay, honey, we're done looking at this house because it exceeds the limitation clause. And a lot of buyers are going to look at that contingency and say, listen, if it's over 3% for repairs, I don't really think we want it because there's going to be some problems or there's potential problems, which, I mean, it all depends on what school you're from. If you're from the school of buying foreclosures, that's not going to apply. But if you're from the school that you have to have an inspection on the sidewalk before you cross the street, yeah, it's going to apply. So the seller must. I'm saying that if you're a buyer's agent, you need to put that in the contract or at least discuss it with the seller and the buyer to find out what their position is going to be if this happens. Next thing about property inspections, the contract negotiations don't begin until the property inspections have been concluded. So the property inspections have had to been concluded because now you can negotiate without that contingency hanging over everybody's head. So for example, if the repairs exceed 3%, if the buyer wants to continue to negotiate, they can. They can see if they can get the buyer up. Or if the inspections clear through under the 3%, then that's great. But most property inspections suggest that the buyer can walk away for any reason during the inspection period. So once you get past that, that's a good thing. You want that to go away. But it is a contingency that has to be addressed, and it's going to continue to have to be addressed until, of course, we get around to the next stupid market like we had a year ago. And when we get there, they'll start waiving inspections again. But I don't see that anytime soon. I talked to my son the other night. He's 37, and I told him he's got one more market, or at least I have one more market that's going to be worth buying in. He'll probably have 2 or 3 at his age, but I got one more, and it's coming up here shortly. I believe it's going to be here by the end of the year. So let me see how to make this thing go. Okay, next. Does anybody have any questions on my opinion on property inspection contingencies? And these are only my opinions, by the way, but this is the way I run my business. Okay, next. Financing contingency. Okay, this is a tough one because you have nothing you can do about it. Nothing you can do about it. What's included in the financing is the interest rate. What interest rate that the buyer is going to accept, the loan terms, 30 years. I know they're going to start financing in here 40 years if they're already not. The interest rate, if there's going to be a buy down, if there's any other terms that the lender is going to lay on this property. But you'll notice in your contract that the interest rate is a separate fill-in clause for the buyer. So when they make their offer, they'll put probably whatever the interest rate is today, and I'm not sure what it is. But some contracts will say that it's market, and buyers may or may not go along with that because if it goes up too high, it's no fun, and they're not going to qualify anyway. So interest rate is something you have to pay attention to in your contract to see what the buyer is asking. Are they asking for something under 6, under 5? Are they looking to get market interest rates? Either way, if I'm a seller, I prefer to see market interest rates in there, but it really doesn't matter because you have no control whatsoever about this thing. Loan terms, we talked about that. They're generally still 30 years. Their payments are still going to include principal, interest, tax, and insurance. There may be PMI depending upon the amount of money they're required to put down. All that's going to be in that section. And there's nothing you can do about anything in those 2 sections. But the one thing you can control is how long you give the buyer to get unconditional loan approval. In other words, get a loan commitment. Because back in the day when we were selling properties at Synergy, we would have the unconditional approval or the loan commitment would be required within 20 days. And I know the standard contract used to give the buyers a substantial period of time. I'm going to say between 5 and 7 days to make application. But if they have to have their unconditional approval and or their loan commitment within 20 days, they have to get that application drawn up the first day. 1 or 2 days in, they got to have their application done. So if you're uncomfortable talking unconditional approval or loan commitment, tighten up the days that the buyer has to make their loan application. Now, if you're on the other end, if you have the buyer and you're looking for a little bit of wiggle room, then extend the days that you want the buyer to have the opportunity to make their loan application. So does everybody understand the difference between an unconditional approval and a conditional approval? Because when we used to put pressure on the buyer, how you doing on your loan? He would say, I'll get you an approval letter today. And it would come through a conditional approval from his mortgage broker. Well, that's lovely. But a conditional approval still has conditional. It's the conditionals in the title. So you just can't. That's not what I'm talking about. When you're approved for a loan to buy my house, you can't tell me there's still conditions to be met because you're not going to get there in time. Now, one of the ways that we overcame that many, many years ago, and I understand It's becoming a practice nowadays. As an investor, if you have a mortgage guy or gal that you trust, give the buyer some motivation or a reason to use your mortgage guy. You know, you pay for their title insurance. Maybe the mortgage guy will kick in and maybe buy their rate down a 1/4% or something. Give the buyer an incentive to use your mortgage broker because that's the guy you can trust. I used to do that, and I'll be damned if I can't remember his name, but he was the best in the world. And he would let me know within 48 hours, this buyer is not going to qualify. Well, listen, that's great because I need to know right out of the box if we stand a chance of selling this house to this guy. Because if you don't stand a chance, let's everybody move on. It's better for everybody. Take your deposit and find something else. Fix your credit and come back later. I don't know what you want to do, but it's great if you have a mortgage guy in your corner that you can trust. So are we clear with unconditional versus conditional approval? Conditional approval means nothing. Anybody? Okay, I'm going to move on. We're going to hit our 25-minute goal tonight, I think. Oh, there it is. The appraisal contingency. So like I said, this just it's so amazing to me back a year ago that people weren't even getting appraisal contingencies. And I understand if they've been looking for houses for 3 months and their wife is killing them, you got to get a house. I understand waiving it. Believe me, I had one of those. I don't encourage it, but I had one of those. Appraisal contingency, it only makes sense for the buyer and for the lender. Now, here's a question for you. I've seen contracts written in both of these ways. One way is that the house has to appraise for the contract price. So the house has to appraise for what the house is selling for. And I've seen other contracts written where the house has to appraise for what the bank is going to loan on the property. Those are two specific numbers, and they're two very different numbers. Personally, if I'm just a regular buyer off the street, I would rather see the property be evaluated and appraised for what I'm paying for it, because that gives me a better night's sleep. Because if you got to take out my 20%, I'm buying something for 300,000. Now it only has to appraise for what? 240? Nah, that's not in my best interest. That's not what I came to this game to play. So in my mind, the property should appraise out for the purchase price, not for what the bank is going to loan. I know the bank is going to look hard at it, but let's face it, if the bank is loaning at 240, aren't they going to feel better with an appraisal at 300 anyways? I would think they would. But that's my feelings about the appraisal contingency. It's going to have to get done. You can't control it. One of the things that I used to do with my agents is I would have my agents meet the appraiser at the house and give them, the appraiser, the best comps that you could come up with for this property. They got to be fair. They got to be within a mile, actually closer than that. They got to be within 6 months if possible. Give it to the appraiser. He'll appreciate the help. He may not use it, but he'll appreciate the help. But that's the only way that you have any influence over the appraisal, is just to give the appraiser updated comps, especially if something sold 2 days ago and it's not in public record yet. It probably hasn't closed yet. I don't know whether the appraiser could use it or not, but you're still trying to get the deal done based on what the market says. So does anybody have any questions about the appraisal contingency? It's pretty square. There's not much you can do about it. Okay. No questions. You guys are either sleeping or I am. Okay. Here's some other contingencies that you may or may not have heard of. The contract being contingent upon the buyer selling their house first. Now, it's been many moons since I've seen a contingency like that, because I don't believe that in the market that we've been in over the past couple of years, that sellers were in need of a buyer that badly, because the way I saw it, buyers were coming out of the woodwork and one was stronger than the next. So they did not have to wait for the buyer to sell their house. But that's one of them that will begin once we turn into a buyer's market again. That's one that's going to start showing their face again. And that's a pain in the butt, because you've got no control over the other deal. So then there's ways to work that contingency. So if you're representing the seller, that you can make it extraordinarily important that the buyer live up to it, and they do things timely, such as requiring them to have price reductions and open houses. And I don't realize open houses don't sell the house, but you get the idea. You put pressure on the buyer so they move forward and they don't sit on it thinking they got this house tied up. Okay, so contingency upon getting married. Yeah, I had now these last two were on deals that I had where the buyer came to me, and that just gives you an idea how long I've been selling. It was property was contingent upon getting married. And that story goes is that the groom and the bride weren't getting along all that well, yet they still were trying to plan for the future without their marriage being consummated yet. And it was down the road. It was they were supposed to get married, and ultimately did, and the deal closed because they waived that contingency, but they had to make sure they got married. Another one, which is more down to earthy, is that it's contingent upon getting a job. You know, somebody comes into town, interviews for a job, it's starting to look good for him, he wants to make plans for his family. I'm not going to move here if I don't get the job. So I understood that one a little bit more. But those are some of the contingencies that I've seen in my years. And does anybody have another contingency that they saw that I didn't mention? Some of you real estate broker people? No? Okay. That's fine. I can't imagine I'm the only one to come up with this stuff, but that's okay. So listen, we're right on time. It's 10 to my schedule. It's 10:19. There's my contact information. Okay. Thank you, Rich. Thanks, Ray and Mandy. Okay, everybody that attended and helped out. Yeah, Ray, always thanks to you, babe, for helping me keep this thing moving straight. Oh, Latona is a little late. Latona, hi, honey. Listen, I'm just finishing up because I call my this training 25 minutes, and I generally run right at 25 minutes.